This is what Thermopylae looks like today, nothing like it did 2,500 years ago. The sea has now receded several miles and it's been accompanied by several meters of silt eroding off the mountains and covering this entire area. But Geological Survey confirms this is the site of the last stand. Back then, with the sheer sides of Mount Kallidromos on one side, a narrow 25-meter pass, and the sea directly on the other. This is the site of the most famous last stand in history. But we're here to ask whether it ever intended to be, or indeed had to be.
This is one of the great legends of all time. You have the great King Leonidas with his 300 Spartans fighting to the death against up to 1 million Persians to save the Western world.
Everybody knows about this legend.
It's the mother of all legends.
The most famous last stand in history.
It's possibly the world's favourite legend.
The ultimate sacrifice?
We all know about this legend. Children have grown up with it.
The performance of the Greek defenders at Thermopylae is still used as a study in the advantages of training, equipment, and the use of terrain as force multipliers in a campaign.
Hollywood in particular can't leave it alone.
Perhaps more importantly, it's also used as a study of the symbol of courage in the face of overwhelming odds.
The legend is fabulous, but the real story is astonishing.
In 480 BC, the Persians collected every fighting man in their empire and unleashed this behemoth on the loose collection of Greek city-states.
This is a massive amount of assembled manpower that is arrayed against the small forces of the Greek states.
This is one of my favourite periods of history because what I think it is the First World War of ancient times. It's a world war because your one combatant is the Persian Empire, and that stretches from India in the east right across to Egypt in North Africa up to the Hellespont, the entrance to the Black Sea. And this huge empire has been created in less than 50 years. So this is not any little enemy. This is a huge organised military machine.
Logic should tell us that the mere might of the empire should have won.
But they do defeat them.
Ten years after Marathon, there was a new king on the Persian throne, Xerxes, son of Darius. The Persians had not forgotten the treachery of Athens in supporting the Ionian revolt, nor the murder of their two emissaries by Athens and Sparta, and it was time to settle matters with the Greeks. The victory of the Greeks at Marathon had angered them, and it was now payback time. The Persians had just put down a revolt in Egypt, so a show of force would also be good for the empire.
It's like you going into my home and burning down my bathroom and thinking you can get away with it. It's silly. The Persian king was always going to punish them for their misdeeds.
Persian preparations for the invasion of Greece were meticulous. Xerxes was known for his engineering feats. For about 4 years they prepared.
Firstly, to transport his army from the coasts of Asia Minor to Greece itself, he bridged the Hellespont, now called the Dardanelles, a distance of 1.5 kilometers. It took 2 attempts, but the bridges, when built, were the longest in the world. The Persians massed the largest invasion force the world had ever seen at that time. A force this size would not be seen again for many hundreds of years.
Send an emissary to each of the main cities in Greece, other than Sparta and Athens. Request tokens of water and earth to ensure peace with Persia. Tell the Greeks that I, Xerxes, the king of 100 nations, will turn water into land and land into water to punish treachery and dishonor. Let it begin! Mardonius, I am well pleased.
Thank you, sire. Are you ready to give the order?
I am. How long will it take all the troops to move into Europe, Mardonius?
About 7 days, sire.
For 7 days and nights they crossed over into Europe. The Persian army was supported by a fleet of maybe 1,200 ships. Xerxes had called up nearly every able-bodied fighting man from across his empire in order to scare the Greeks into surrender.
Now, the size of the Persian army that was arrayed against Greece is where we start to see the legend of the Persian Wars encroach upon the history. Herodotus gives us a figure of 5 million men, a figure which has to be greatly exaggerated. Most modern estimates place the number of the Persian army at somewhere between 150 and 200,000.
But when you add the fleet and the baggage train, Xerxes was commanding close to 500,000 men.
The one danger that such a large army had was its logistics. Ancient historians say that the army drank rivers dry as it passed through areas. Now, while somewhat of a literary embellishment, it may not be far from the truth.
Another of Xerxes' massive building feats was a canal which he cut at the base of the Mount Athos Peninsula. This canal was, according to Herodotus, over 12 stadia long, around 2.2 kilometers. Greek spies had been sent to Sardis to watch these activities, but the Persians captured them. They then released them, knowing that they would go home and spread fear amongst the Greek states about the huge size of the Persian invasion force.
When the Greeks heard of the size of the Persian force, they convened a congress at the city of Corinth. They had been hearing about the Persian preparations for over 2 years, so they knew that the Persians really meant business this time.
The Persians sent emissaries to all the major Greek cities, other than Athens and Sparta, demanding tokens of submission. They even formed an alliance with the Carthaginians, who agreed to attack the Greeks in Sicily so that they could not send aid to the Greek homeland. The Athenians invited Leonidas, the war king of Sparta, to meet with them. History records that he was the ultimate warrior, brave, devoted to his people, and obedient to the death.
At Marathon, we could not help Athens in time due to our religious laws. This time, I pledge Sparta stands ready to help all of Greece. Sparta, with the strongest army, will lead. And I invite the rest of Greece to unite and follow.
The words that all Greece wanted to hear. So it is clear, we are united. Athens places its fleet also under the command of Sparta. I see merit in trying to stop the enemy before he reaches our main cities. Their army's large, and they will struggle to feed them all if they are delayed in the wilds of northern Greece.
The road from Thrace leads by one narrow pass, the Vale of Tempe, into Thessaly. If we block that, the enemy will have to dislodge us.
If we march swiftly, we can be there in time. Themistocles, does Athens join Sparta in this mission?
Of course.
If we do not get there in time, we should have a second plan.
The hot gates at Thermopylae protect all Greece to the south.
The channel between there and Euboea is narrow. Our fleet can block the Persians on the sea as well.
Then that is where we will defend, if we fail to block them at the Vale of Tempe.
10,000 Spartan and Athenian hoplites were sent north to block the Vale of Tempe. However, when they arrived, they found that the Persians were already entering Thessaly by another route, and many states to the south had already capitulated, so the army withdrew quickly.
Having failed in Thessaly, the Greeks decided to fall back to the next line of defence at the pass of Thermopylae, with a naval blockade at the Strait of Artemisium.
This means all of northern Greece is lost. It is most important now that we block the Persians at Thermopylae.
The legend that has been passed down is that Leonidas, having heard the prediction of the oracle at Delphi that either a Spartan king must die or Sparta will fall, went to Thermopylae with his personal bodyguard against the wishes of the Ephors on what was basically a suicide mission. And we also hear that religious festivals prevented Sparta and some other cities from sending any more troops. Yet today, some historians disagree that this is the full story. Some of the most memorable moments in this period of history involve the predictions of the Delphic oracle. Indeed, many modern books and movies focus on these predictions. The Athenians got one about the wooden walls, and Sparta received an equally important oracle as well, about the death of a king.
Your fate, O inhabitants of the broad fields of Sparta, is to see your great and famous city destroyed by the sons of Perseus. Either that, or everyone within the borders of Lacedaemon must mourn the death of a king, sprung from the line of Heracles.
Basically, this oracle predicted that either a Spartan king would die or Sparta would fall to Persia. These two oracles are a major part of the legend that has come down to us. But today there is some skepticism among scholars about oracles in general, and why they appear in the histories.
We now get into a part of the story that is almost pure fiction encroaching on fact.
In the Greek world, everyone believes that the gods are present, make their power felt. And some gods at certain times will give signs about what might happen.
They were a very religious people, and that they wouldn't go into battle without consulting the gods. I mean, Thucydides tells us that oracles could be reinterpreted, or words could be remembered differently to suit particular occasions.
I mean, there's a school of thought that the oracles are added afterward.
I don't think we can attach a lot of credibility to the oracles that we hear about in an author like Herodotus.
This is clearly a later piece of Greek propaganda to account for the loss at the pass. 13 city-states sent 7,500 men to defend the Thermopylae position. Athens recruited 40,000 men to man 200 triremes for the blockade of Artemisium.
Leonidas went to Thermopylae with orders to fight and to win. He had the Ephors' approval and had their instructions, and he believed that he would be receiving more troops.
The Roman writer Nepos merely says that Leonidas took 300 picked men with him. Herodotus says that these men were chosen all on the basis that they were men that had living sons. It is often assumed that this was done so that none of the families of these men would die out from what was supposedly a suicidal mission. However, one of the benefits of choosing men with living sons is that they would have been somewhat older than the rest of the Spartan army and therefore more experienced. This represents the cream of the Spartan military that Leonidas took with him to Thermopylae.
There is a story that Leonidas only took his bodyguard, the men who would only be subject to his orders, but the numbers do not add up, because the royal bodyguard was only 100 men, and he took 300. However, the pass at Thermopylae is only 20 to 25 meters wide. The Spartans, in their typical 8-rank deep phalanx, would need around 200 to 250 hoplites to fill this gap, leaving 50 or more in reserve to replace casualties. So the 300 may have simply been what Leonidas considered necessary to hold that gap for a week until the relief army arrived.
Even with the advantage of the terrain that negated the Persians' vast superior numbers, the mission of Leonidas was still incredibly dangerous. If the Persian army or navy had found a way to outflank the Greeks, the Greek forces would be annihilated as they tried to withdraw.
I fear you will not return.
If I thought there was another way, I would not go. I only see disaster if I do not act.
I cannot change your mind.
No. I am sorry.
Then it is so.
There is a lot of debate about what happened at the past, and most of this is because of the legend. It has overshadowed a lot of what's happened like a heavy mist, obscuring and confusing. However, buried in the original account by the historian Herodotus are 6 key passages that tell us to look beyond the legend to the real story.
So the force that the Spartans sent to Thermopylae under their king Leonidas was merely part of the grander strategy. Leonidas was to hold the Persian army in place until a relief army could arrive. We know this is the case because Herodotus tells us that the cities of Phocis and Locrian Opus only committed troops to the defensive position once they had received news that the contingents that were already on their way were only the advanced guard of a larger army which was soon to follow.
The first key passage from Herodotus. 2 cities only committed troops to the defence of the pass after they were told a much larger army was to follow.
The defence of Thermopylae was simply a sound military campaign. Use the terrain and supply problems to defeat your enemy. It's not the only time this strategy has been used with great success.
This passage alone puts an end to the legend. This was an organised military campaign, no suicide mission.
Armies march on their stomachs. It's an old saying, but still very true. Supply problems have defeated some of the greatest invasions in history. For example, the invasions of Russia in 1812 and again in 1941. It was no different in 480 BC. The Persian army still needed to eat and drink.
The point in the pass where the bulk of the fighting took place was only around 20 metres wide. It was further reinforced by an old wall, known as the Phocian Wall, that the Greeks repaired and encamped behind. This smaller force in the narrow battlefield meant that the Greeks would not encounter the same logistical and supply problems that the Persians faced. This meant the small force in the pass could hold out almost indefinitely, so long as their position held firm.
The huge Persian army, however, would begin to suffer supply problems almost immediately, particularly as the Athenian fleet blocking the strait at Artemisium was preventing the Persian fleet from bringing up supplies by sea.
Roads in this part of the world, northern Greece and Thrace, were almost non-existent. There were only beaten paths between cities. Moving cargo by land was slow and unreliable.
Most cargo was moved by sea if at all possible, and that's why the Persian army needed to have its fleet close by most of the time.
As the Persian army moved to Thermopylae, they were watched in awe by the Greeks, and in particular by a Malian shepherd known as Ephialtes, a name that would come down to us through history as the archetypal traitor.
Greetings, Themistocles.
Not long after the Greeks had arrived at Thermopylae, they were advised of the existence of a path that went from the plain to the north, up over the mountain, and down behind their position. This information was given to them by a local shepherd. Leonidas immediately took steps to prevent his position from being outflanked. Herodotus records that 1,000 hoplites from Phocis promised to keep guard on the path for Leonidas.
And what of the fleet?
We're in the strait, and the Persians cannot get around us. They show no urgency at all.
Good. The slower they are, the better for us.
I must depart. I will leave one small ship here to maintain contact with you.
The Persian army was so large that it took several days to arrive at Thermopylae, and when it did, its campfires stretched back across the Gulf of Malea for many kilometers. The Athenian fleet was in an excellent position to block the Persians at sea, and this was crucial because otherwise the Persian fleet could simply have sailed behind the Greek lines, dropped men off, thus trapping them.
While the Persians outnumbered the Greeks more than 25 to 1 at Thermopylae, man for man, the Persians were not as good as the Greeks, and especially not as good as the Spartans.
At this time, Greek armies consisted of heavy infantry called hoplites. They were heavily armoured, carried a large shield, and used an 8-foot spear.
Ambush tactics and even things like missile weapons such as slings and bows and arrows were looked down upon because it wasn't seen to be manly. You had to prove yourself by standing up and facing your enemy in this rugged hand-to-hand combat.
The Persian army will consist of aristocratic cavalry, but they make up a small minority, and beneath them are the famous immortals, the 10,000 elite Persian infantry, stout, no tall, strong boys, and trained. But the bulk of the troops have been raised from all the provinces or satrapies of the Persian Empire, and they vary. Some of them will be the guard troops of governors, some will have been used to suppress revolts or bandits, but others will have been conscripted from the fields, from the farms. They just have to rely upon their native weapons and their native skill because they've had very little formal training. It can be said of the Persian army that it would kill for the great king but not die for him.
Queen Artemisia of Halicarnassus, a Greek state which had pledged allegiance to the Persians, brought 5 ships to aid the Persian navy. Artemisia would have been able to enlighten Xerxes about the Spartans and also the divisions that pervaded Greek society and their never-ending petty wars against each other. And Xerxes became overconfident.
It sounds like I'm coming to save these Greeks from themselves. Aldanis, tomorrow morning we will send a messenger to the Greeks. Offer any that agree safe conduct and my pardon if they lay down their weapons. We will see if their solidarity lasts.
On day 1, the Greeks were ready. The phalanx was in the narrow gap, the flanks perfectly secure, and fresh troops in reserve. The Athenian fleet was in a similarly strong defensive position in the narrow channel to the north, and the rear of the Greeks was covered by the Phocian hoplites guarding that narrow path atop the 3,000-foot high ridge. Leonidas also posted scouts on the high ground so he could be informed of the Persian moves, what Herodotus calls day watchers. He seems to have thought of everything.
My king says, if you throw down your weapons, he will pardon you and give you a safe passage back to your cities.
You want our weapons? Then tell your king, come and take them!
Sire, the Greeks have rejected your offer.
What did they say? Exactly.
That if you want their weapons, you should come and take them.
We shall see. Mardonius, begin the attack.
Yes, sire.
Persian only attack the Greeks from along the narrow approach along the seashore. The Persian army was already getting a little hungry. The army and the fleet carrying most of its supplies had already been separated for several days by now.
On the first day of the battle, the Greeks deployed some of their forces in front of the Phocian wall to engage the Persians while the rest remained in reserve on the other side behind the wall. These troops then fought in relays. As one contingent became fatigued, it would be withdrawn and a new fresh load brought up from the reserves. This ensured that the Greeks always had fresh troops to face any Persian assault.
At the pass, after seeing the determination of the Greeks as they waited for his attack, Xerxes firstly deployed the Persian archers. These were virtually useless against the heavy Greek armour when fired from the front at longer range. He then sent masses of Persian levies, Medes and Scythians, to fight the Greeks. Their aggressive attacks were easily repelled by the phalanx of Greek hoplites. The Medes and Scythians failed because they could not use their superior numbers in the narrow area, and their weapons and armour were inferior to the Greeks. In particular, they had no answer to the longer Greek spears. The Persians repeated these attacks time and time again. Xerxes was not going to be denied. The archers would fire, then the infantry mount an attack. The results were the same each time. It was like hitting your head on a brick wall. The Persian casualties mounted. Other troops would swap with the Spartans to give them a rest, and they were all having a good time. It was what a hoplite dreamed about, enemies with shorter weapons and lighter armour that could only come at them head on.
The size of the pass here at Thermopylae was key to Greek success. As the Persians approached this narrow area, they had the sea on their left, a massive wall backed by the massive mountains on their right, leaving a pass that was only roughly 25 meters. Here, the Greeks could fight in tight unison, with comrades waiting behind to replace those in the front ranks as they fell or became too tired.
Madonius! Do something! Do something now!
Yes, sire.
Xerxes then spearheaded the Persian assault with his personal guard, the 10,000-strong contingent of Immortals. However, their numbers were also of no advantage in the cramped space of the pass, and their shorter spears made them unable to engage the Greeks at close quarters. Sometimes a Persian hero would challenge a Greek to single combat. However, this would not work with the Greeks, who were trained to fight in the phalanx and would not break ranks. In some cities, it was against the law to break ranks for any reason, and so they just waited for the Persians in their phalanx. The Persian army could not employ its maneuver tactics in these confined areas, which resulted in a head-on clash, a clash in which the Persians were at a great disadvantage with their shorter spears and lighter armour. Greek spears presented the biggest problem. The tight Greek formations meant that 2 or 3 Greeks were attacking one Persian in the front row with their longer spears, while the Persians could hardly reach the front rank of the Greeks with their shorter spears.
The Persians were fighting on a narrow front against men heavily armoured and with much longer weapons. The terrain funneled the Persians down onto this formation, and it was much like being fed straight into a mincer.
Mardonius, what is happening? Why can our men not beat these Greeks?
Sire, our war style depends on getting around the flanks of the enemy to attack, where they are less protected. In this pass, we cannot do this.
Mardonius is right. Greeks, especially Spartans, like nothing better than to confront the enemy head-on and settle an issue with brute force.
Sire, if we occupy the pass when I
This
suggested...
is not the time for recriminations, Hardanis. We have to win this battle.
The Athenians had shown at Marathon 10 years earlier that if the flanks of their phalanx were secure, they could beat a much larger Persian army. Thermopylae was the perfect position to put their phalanx. Their flanks were perfectly secure.
What of my fleet?
Nothing was going according to plan for the Persians. Their huge fleet could not penetrate the shoals of the Strait of Artemisium. In a skirmish with the Greeks, several ships had run aground, and the situation there was no better than Thermopylae.
Sire, might I suggest we block the straits ourselves, while we dispatch a fleet around the island of Euboea. That fleet will then trap the Greek fleet. Whichever way they turn, we will have them. Then we can lend men behind the Greeks in the pass and cut them off. In the meantime, we will continue our attack on the Greeks to distract them from our intentions.
Sire, I would have a little surprise for the Spartans tomorrow.
The Greeks must have been feeling very pleased. They had seen off a huge all-day attack with relatively few casualties. The fleet was holding in the strait, and Leonidas had sent runners and had scouts watching everything. He must have felt completely in control of the situation. He knew that every day they held off the Persians, their difficulties with their supplies would increase and their morale would drop.
The Greek style of fighting, the phalanx, these tight close shields with long spears, had once again proved itself incredibly successful as long as the flanks remained secure. In fighting, if not always in their political lives, the Greeks were united.
On day 2, the situation was exactly the same as it had been on day 1. The Persians had achieved nothing and had lost a lot of men, and the rest were getting hungrier.
Now watch, sire.
On the second day, elite Persian spearmen under Hydarnes were sent to fight in the narrow pass. In total, it's believed the Greeks resisted as many as 50,000 Persians on the second day. Persian archery was again largely negated by heavy Greek armour, and their numbers counted for little in the narrow bottleneck of the pass. Once they were locked in the melee, the Persians suffered terribly from their lack of protective armour and from the poor protection of their wickerwork shields. The Greek hoplites that defended the pass were in their element. Greek warfare revolved around close combat, and the average hoplite was far better equipped and trained for hand-to-hand fighting than his Persian adversary.
But the Spartans were having such an easy time overcoming the weaker Persian armour with their longer weapons that they actually refused to withdraw and allow any of the other Greeks to have a go. This greatly upset many of the other Greek contingents who were eager for the fight.
It is possible that this dissatisfaction over not fighting affected the attitude of the non-Spartan Greeks on the following day. But for now, the Greeks in the Thermopylae Pass were totally dominant over the Persians because they had heavier armour and shields, but mostly because they had longer spears, so the terrain was tailor-made for their fighting style. At the end of the fighting on day 2 at Thermopylae, the Greeks would have been thinking, another couple of days and we will win.
My best troops, my immortals, scattered like antelope!
These Greeks are not human, sire! They show no fear!
Nothing worked for the Persians on day 2. Even their naval force was forced to retire due to a severe storm.
If only we occupied the pass!
Hydarnes, do not ever mention that again! Begone from my sight!
By the night of day 2, the Persians had pretty much run out of ideas. The Greeks must have been on a high, waiting for their reinforcements, because then they must have thought they could go on the offensive.
By the evening of day 2, the Persians had still achieved nothing. They had lost more men, and they were getting hungrier.
However, that evening, Xerxes learned something that changed the course of the battle.
Speak!
Your Excellency, my name is Ephialtes. I'm a Malian shepherd.
I don't need any sheep.
You don't understand! Excellency, I know these mountains. There is a path that can take you to the other side of Thermopylae.
What? Are you sure?
Yes! Excellency! I can show you!
What do you want in return?
I am but a poor man.
If you're right, not anymore. Come with me.
Sire, I know a path through the mountains that can take you to the other side of Thermopylae.
A path?
Yes, sire. A path to victory.
Why are you doing this?
I am a poor man. And your generosity, sire, is known throughout the world.
If you are right, you will have as much gold as you can carry. Adonis, you take this man and half the immortals, and follow this path immediately. If it is false or a trap, I only want to see this man's head again.
So Xerxes learnt about the path that led behind the Spartan lines. But the Spartans already knew about it. Leonidas had already sent 1,000 Phocians to guard the path, so Ephialtes, the Greek shepherd's betrayal, should not by itself have irreversibly led to the loss of Thermopylae.
We now get to one of the most problematic aspects of the histories of the Persian Wars. That is what happened on day 3 at Thermopylae. For this battle, these sources vary, none of which paint a definitive picture of what actually took place.
Sometime during the night between day 2 and 3, Leonidas was informed that the Persians had found the path across the mountain. Firstly, an Ionian deserter came in from the Persian camp and relayed this information. Also, Herodotus records that the day watchers came down from the mountain and told him. So Leonidas must have had scouts up on the ridge watching the Persian camp.
At this point, Leonidas, according to Herodotus, did not call a council of war.
The second key passage from Herodotus. Why wait 10 or more hours before even calling a council of war? It doesn't make sense. If the position was now hopeless, as we are led to believe by the legend, every minute was vital to allow any troops retreating to get the hell out of there.
It appears that Leonidas was not really that concerned that the Persians had discovered the path.
When Leonidas had learned of this path over the Kallidromos ridge, he sent a contingent of 1,000 Phocian hoplites to hold the path.
And a pair path. This is the back of Mount Kallidromos on the other side of Thermopylae. It's about 3,000 feet here, and on the peaks behind up to about 4,000. The Immortals must have marched about 60 kilometers from late on day 2 through the night to arrive behind the defenders on the morning of day 3. It was an incredibly treacherous march. The terrain is steep, wooded, difficult, and this was done at night, guided by only one poor Greek shepherd.
The fact that Leonidas didn't call a council of war or take any action at this point indicates that he was not worried by this new development.
If he was ordering a retreat and staying to cover that retreat, then he would have sent his troops packing as soon as possible so that they could put distance between themselves and the Persians.
Was Leonidas incompetent?
I don't think Leonidas was incompetent.
So, did Leonidas blunder badly?
Or did he have a plan?
Leonidas was no fool. He knew his limitations. His defence was not troubled in the first 2 days.
Incompetent? I don't think so. He set up an excellent defence. He knew the strengths and weaknesses of his force, and he used them perfectly in the first 2 days.
Leonidas obviously was not worried. He had known of the possibility of being outflanked for several days, so he had plenty of time to make plans.
He had a plan.
The situation had changed, but was not critical on the morning of day 3.
Leonidas still had 1,000 men protecting his flank, guarding a narrow path in steep wooded terrain at the top of a 3,000-foot high ridge. He still held the Thermopylae Pass, with nearly 2,000 mainly fresh troops, and the Athenian fleet was still in position. He also had 3,000 fresh troops behind him in a position to block the Immortals, who had marched all night and who had to get through the Phocians first.
Not critical, yet. But 2 events early on day 3 would have been a huge boost to the morale of the Persians. Events Leonidas could not have anticipated.
It must be one of the more memorable marches in military history. May I explain why Leonidas did not call a council of war? immediately on hearing of the move to try and take the path, instead waiting until many hours after the dawn the next day. It's an incredibly steep and treacherous move, and you would have thought that the Phocians could have held this pass, especially against the Immortals who were climbing all this way in full armour and with little rest, even if it meant the Phocians just raining rocks down on them.
The Phocians should have had a huge advantage.
Every advantage was with the Phocians, who were facing exhausted enemies from a strong defensive position on high ground.
So it may be that Leonidas just greatly underestimated the tenacity of the Immortals and their commander Hydarnes.
Nevertheless, with the Greek shepherd to lead them, the Persian king sent his best warriors, the Immortals, to the path that night. Herodotus records that the Immortals reached the plateau of the mountain at dawn, and the Phocians, who had promised to guard the pass, were alerted to their presence.
By the rustling of the leaves under the Persian feet.
The Persian troops were surprised at the presence of the Phocians standing in their way. But the Phocians were not expecting an attack, and so were also taken by surprise.
A fatal mistake. It takes time to put on a set of heavy armour, time that the Phocians did not have because of their carelessness. In one blow, they lost most of their advantage over the Immortals.
The Persians attacked quickly.
The Phocians withdrew to a defensive position slightly uphill from the path, assuming that they were the focus of the Persian attack. The Persians, however, marched right past to try and trap Leonidas and his fellow Greeks in the pass.
Phocis would have been the next city to fall if the Persians managed to capture the pass.
The Phocians had everything to lose and nothing to gain. They would have stood and fought, at least for a while.
The Phocians had committed a fatal blunder. They had given up the advantage of the high ground overlooking the path for the plateau, and had not posted scouts, allowing themselves to be surprised.
Having scattered the Phocians so easily, the Immortals would now be on an adrenaline high. Tired as they were, they would have been refreshed and confident as they advanced quickly on the Greek rear.
In fact, Herodotus says that the Immortals, after scattering the Phocians, went down the mountain with speed.
After their skirmish with the Phocians, the Immortals continued their advance across the Kallidromos Ridge. That blunder by the Phocians would prove fatal later that day for those who remained in the pass at Thermopylae. But what did happen that day?
According to Herodotus, on the morning of day 3 of the Battle of Thermopylae, Leonidas did not call a council of war until, and I quote, "day was a thorough bringing forth to light." That is, many hours after he was told the Immortals were on the path, trying to surround him.
It thus seems that Leonidas was not that worried that the Persians had found the path, but he could not have known the outcome of the battle between the Phocians and the Immortals, nor that the Immortals were on the move again, because the battle had taken place several kilometers away behind a 3,000-foot high ridge at roughly the same time as he was holding a council of war. When Leonidas had arrived at the pass, he'd had roughly 7,000 men with him. 1,000 were sent to guard the path, leaving 6,000 with him here at the pass. Leonidas ordered 400 Thebans to stay, and 1,000 Thespians volunteered to stay behind. He sent the rest of the troops away, something we will examine later on.
The third key passage from Herodotus. Why did Leonidas keep nearly 2,000 men with him on day 3? He had held the pass with only 300 men on day 2. If the situation was suddenly hopeless, why keep so many men with him?
Men, eat a hearty breakfast. In a while we'll have some more sport. And then, tonight, we dine in Hades! Spartans! Greeks! The order for today is to kill as many barbarians as we can! Make sure they never forget who we are!
The Persian attack was delayed by Xerxes to give time for the Immortals to get into position. Leonidas did not wait for the attack. Instead, he advanced his phalanx further out into the pass and fell upon the Persians. Herodotus tells us that the Thebans turned at the first chance and surrendered to the Persians, claiming that they were forced to fight against their will, and begged forgiveness.
The desertion of the Thebans was crucial.
Losing 20% of your troops deserting in one go would have been devastating to the plans of Leonidas. He now had to reorganise and, more importantly, thin his line to fill the wider part of the pass. The Theban desertion must have also demoralised the Greeks as they confronted the huge Persian army.
It was a blow the Greeks never recovered from at a vital stage of the last day, and it would have raised the Persian morale as well.
Would have shattered the morale of most of the Greeks.
The Greeks fought in a wider part of the pass than before in an attempt to kill as many enemies as possible. Thousands of Persians were slain, but the Greek spears started to break in the onslaught and the Greek losses began to mount. The battle raged with incredible ferocity. The Persians were being whipped forward by their officers, and the Greeks knew if they held out today, they could win the war.
Now, the plan of Leonidas was collapsing.
The Theban desertion changed the whole game situation in a flash.
Now Leonidas could only hope that his reserve of fresh troops could defeat the Immortals and then come to his aid.
And one of the first to fall was King Leonidas. Around his body, one of the fiercest battles took place. Four times the Persians attacked to obtain it, and 4 times they were repulsed.
The Persians, closing in from both sides, were now ready and eager for the fight. The slaughter on days 1 and 2 would have motivated them to have their revenge.
The Immortals were coming at speed, on a high after their victory over the Phocians.
They had seen off 1,400 Greek troops, the Phocians and the Thebans, for virtually no loss. The Persians were ready and eager for revenge.
By now, Hydarnes and his Immortals were closing in from the other side, brushing aside any rear guard left there.
It seems on the last day, the Persians did not try to confront the phalanx head-on, as they had on the first 2 days, but rather to spar with the Greeks and wear them down, throw javelins and pick away at them.
Herodotus says the Persians sent forward their throwing troops. These would have been troops carrying javelins or throwing spears.
This was a tactic that they also used at the Battle of Plataea a year later.
The Greeks returned to the narrow part of the pass and fought until their spears were broken before using their swords and even rocks, bare hands and their teeth. They were finally overtaken by the Persians. By now the Greeks were nearly at an end, with Hydarnes closing in from the rear and the main army pressing from the front. They were surrounded and doomed, but they fought on.
As the Greek spears began to break under the constant onslaught, the Persians became more and more aggressive. They could sense victory.
The surviving Spartans, Thespians and Helots withdrew to the nearby Kolonos Hill, where they were eventually overwhelmed in a final squalid slaughter.
Give us the body, and you can live.
The body of Leonidas was beheaded and his head placed on a stake for the whole Persian army to see as they marched on to Athens. His bones would not return to Sparta for many years.
The traditional glorified view of the Battle of Thermopylae is that although it wasn't a complete success in halting the Persian advance, it did buy the time necessary for the other Greek cities to be able to muster a force of sufficient strength to inflict a real defeat on the Persians later that year. But some would argue the opposite, that Thermopylae was a disaster, that valuable troops were lost, that the gain in days was insignificant, and that it revealed a certain underlying mistrust or resentment among the Greeks, that Greek unity was very fragile indeed.
Most of the glory, however, went to the Spartans. A marble lion was erected by the Greeks in honor of Leonidas, the Lion of Sparta. 2 other monuments were erected to honor the Greeks that fell, and on one of them was written, "O stranger, tell the Lacedaemonians that we lie here, obedient to their laws." So died Leonidas, the Lion King of Sparta, arguably the most famous warrior in history.
When you remove these layers of legend that surround the character of Leonidas, all he turns out to be is a Spartan king following his orders who happens to die during the events that he is at.
He was a good Spartan. He did what he was supposed to do. He went out and he died.
So Leonidas was just obeying Spartan law.
But why aren't you dead?
The king ordered me to bring back a final message.
Speak.
Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie.
So did Leonidas know that he was going to die, as the tale of the oracle would suggest? Did his stand in the pass merely represent a form of ritual suicide? Modern historians don't think so.
The oracle story makes Leonidas sacrifice himself as a willing victim to achieve the Greek victory. But we can be sure that the Greeks didn't send a force to Thermopylae to let a Spartan king die a glorious death.
Thermopylae was never a suicide mission.
So how did it all end up like this? The body of Leonidas being dragged up the hill by a few surviving Greeks before all of them dying to a man. Was it simply because they had been betrayed when the path had been revealed to the Persians by the Greek shepherd? Remember, for 2 days, the Spartans had had little trouble holding back the Persian hordes in this narrow pass here, inflicting many casualties.
They could see that the Persians had got no answers.
And yet on day 3, the story goes that they committed themselves to a suicide mission. Yet, does Herodotus' narrative indicate that we should actually take a different interpretation of these events?
If we look back to earlier in this campaign, when the Greeks under the Spartans went to the Vale of Tempe, they also found out they were being outflanked. But instead of the Spartans committing ritual suicide at their posts, they withdrew with the other Greeks.
Spartans never retreating? It's a myth. They had already retreated once in this war.
So the myth about Spartans never retreating seems to be just that, a myth. So why didn't Leonidas immediately withdraw from Thermopylae as they had done at Tempe, as soon as he found out that the Persians were outflanking him?
Leonidas kept nearly 6 times as many men with him on day 3 as held the pass on day 2. Why? Why?
If Leonidas was covering the withdrawal of the other troops, why not stay with only enough troops to cover the 25-metre gap?
The 4th key passage from Herodotus, the Greek moves in the morning. The Greeks had advanced towards the Persians in a wider part of the Thermopylae Pass. Why?
Why not stay in the narrow and most defensible part of the pass?
He had a plan.
And it was not suicide.
Leonidas was sending a message to the Persians. He was not worried, and he was coming to teach them a lesson.
Another vital clue from Herodotus that suggests that Leonidas had not just sent all those troops away is that the Greek defenders on day 3 had advanced to a wider part of the pass to give battle. Herodotus then records that after the death of Leonidas, the surviving Greeks, learning of the approach of the Immortals, began to retreat to the Phocian Wall and then to the Kolonos Hill.
The 5th passage from Herodotus, the description of the battle. Once the Greeks with Leonidas were told of the approach of the Immortals, they still had enough time to retreat back behind the wall to the Kolonos Hill.
The Greek heavy infantry could not simply run back to the Kolonos Hill once the battle had started. They had to keep facing the enemy and slowly backtrack.
The Greeks had heavier armour than the Persians and therefore were slower. They couldn't turn their backs and run, yet they had enough time to do a fighting retreat.
They were able to retreat almost a kilometre away from an enemy being whipped forward in a killing frenzy.
The Immortals, on the other hand, could advance at a rapid rate unless they were still fighting the Greek reserves.
With the Phocian Wall and the Kolonos Hill behind them, the troops with Leonidas could not have seen the Immortals coming until they were at the Phocian Wall.
The Immortals were coming at speed, on a high after their victory over the Phocians. If there were no troops facing them, they would have been in the rear of the pass defenders in no time.
So there must have been Greek troops stationed as a rear guard behind the Greeks with Leonidas, enough troops who at least informed the others that the Immortals were coming, and held the Immortals long enough for the other Greek troops to stage a fighting retreat of up to a kilometre to get back to the Kolonos Hill. Another major point that suggests that day 3 at Thermopylae was not ritual suicide or a foregone conclusion is that the Athenian fleet stayed in position until the next morning, after Leonidas had died, only then retreating quickly to organise the evacuation of Athens.
The last passage from Herodotus. If, as the legend says, the Greek position had become hopeless when the Persians found the path around Thermopylae, Why didn't the Athenian fleet retreat immediately?
If anyone was going to retreat from Thermopylae in a hurry, it was the Athenian fleet. But they stayed there.
If the situation had now become hopeless, why wait?
When the pass fell, nothing would stop the Persians reaching Athens, only 85 miles away. The Athenians would need every second to evacuate Athens, yet the fleet stayed for that extra day.
On day 3, the situation had changed, but it wasn't hopeless.
He had a plan.
Remember, Leonidas had not called a council of war immediately when he found out that the Persians had found the Anapaea path. Instead, he waited till morning, and then he kept the Spartans, the Thebans, and the 1,000 Thespian volunteers and stayed at his post. So if we believe Herodotus, Leonidas dismissed over half his fighting force on the morning of day 3, which seems a little bit at odds with his mission to stay and win, to hold the pass until the relief force arrived.
We are told that many of the Greek contingents are sent back. Some suggest because they are unreliable. Others suggest that they are sent back so that they can defend Attica and fight another day.
If Leonidas sent these troops back to fight another day, why didn't he order their retreat hours earlier, when he first found out the Persians were on the path?
They must have been held to cover his rear, because by the time he issued orders, the Immortals were already descending onto the coast road and cutting off any retreat.
There is another, perhaps much more reasonable explanation as to why he sent the majority of his troops back down the pass.
I mean, when you think about it, positioning these so-called dismissed troops in a position to hit the Immortals in the flank as they descended from the Anapaea path makes perfect strategic and tactical sense. The Greek forces that were sent back were relatively rested. The Immortals, on the other hand, had fought against the Spartans and had suffered severe casualties at their hands. They'd also had very little time to rest and recuperate before being sent over the path during the night.
The Greek reserve was fresh and fully supplied. The Immortals were very tired and short of food. The Greeks still held many aces.
So what seems to make sense from the point of view of military strategy is that he kept enough men with him to hold the pass for another day and sent more than half his troops back to engage the Immortals. But it all came unstuck. For some reason, the troops he sent back to support the Phocians, it wasn't a success in halting the Persian advance.
Why these troops failed to do so, we just don't know.
Maybe it was their dissatisfaction at the way that the Spartans were keeping all the glory for themselves, fighting in the front ranks. But whatever the case, the Spartans and the Thespians continued to fight bravely with Leonidas, and even after his death they continued to fight until they realized that the Persian Immortals were absolutely in their rear. Only then did they pull back and accept their fate, having been abandoned by the Greeks who had left them. The Thebans had surrendered to the Persians, the Phocians had blundered holding the Immortals on the Anapaea path, and the rest of the Greeks, for whatever reason, had allowed the Immortals to attack the Spartans from behind. Every aspect of Leonidas' strategy makes sense in terms of wanting to hold the pass for another day, apart from this idea of his outright dismissal of over half his troops. So Leonidas may not only have been betrayed by Ephialtes, the Greek shepherd, on that fateful day, but also in a way by many of the other Greeks. And that is something no ancient Greek narrative is going to have stressed.
He had a plan.
And it wasn't suicide.
He planned to win the war on the last day.
But when you follow the 6 major clues in the original ancient text, you come to one inescapable conclusion.
Leonidas may have overreached on the last day, but there is no doubt that he was badly let down by at least 2 other groups of Greek soldiers.
If the Thebans had not deserted, it may well have been a very different story.
He could have won the war on the last day. If he had survived day 3 and was still holding the pass, who knows what the hungry and demoralized Persians would have done.
It all comes down to those key passages in Herodotus, where and when the events took place. They paint a different picture than the legend.
Despite the final outcome, the Battle of Thermopylae was still an heroic action, especially by the Greeks, and that is why we still remember it today.
Leonidas, the Lion King of Sparta, came within a whisker of winning one of the most improbable victories in history. If he held the pass for another day, he may well have broken the Persians' resolve. In the end, he was undone by the very disunity that haunted virtually all of ancient Greek history.